The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. Just another strange customer at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. But now, I wish I had paid attention sooner. I wish I had never taken this job. I worked the night shift at a gas station off a lonely highway, miles away from anything that matters. It's the kind of place where travelers stop for gas and snacks, maybe a quick bathroom break, and then disappear into the night, never to be seen again. The neon sign flickers, half the bulbs are dead, and the buzzing lights inside make the place feel colder than it should be. Outside, the road stretches in a black nothingness, flanked by dense, silent woods that seem to breathe when the wind moves through them. I've been here for 6 months. At first, I liked the solitude. No supervisors breathing down my neck, no annoying coworkers, just me and the occasional late-night visitor. But over time, I started noticing things. Weird things. Like Eric. He never arrives in a car. He just walks up from the tree line, quiet as a shadow, always at the exact same time. 3:07 a.m. Every single night. He steps up to the counter, places a crumpled bill down, and says the same thing. 1 gallon. That's it. No small talk, no questions. He doesn't smell like alcohol, doesn't look high, just empty. His clothes are dark, worn, and always the same. A heavy jacket, even in the summer, boots that look older than I am. His face is pale, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, with eyes that seem too deep, too hollow. I never thought much of it at first. People are weird. Some loner living off the grid? Fine. Not my business. But then I started paying attention. One night, curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped outside after he left. The road was empty. No cars. No taillights. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Eric was gone. Not a single footprint in the dirt where he should have walked. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the wind had already covered his tracks. Maybe I'd been too slow, and he had slipped away before I looked. That made sense, right? But it kept happening. Every night, without fail. He would show up, buy a gallon of gas, then vanish. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Tonight, as I stand behind the counter, watching the security monitor, my hands grip the edge of the register. The digital clock on the wall ticks over. 3:07 a.m. I swallow hard. The screen flickers. And just like always, he's there. Standing outside. Waiting. I don't scare easily. Working the night shift at a gas station teaches you that. You see all kinds of people. Truckers running on fumes. Lost travelers with eyes full of panic. Drunks who slur their way through buying cigarettes. It's a lonely job, but I like it that way. Or at least, I used to. There was one customer who didn't fit into any category. A man named Eric. He showed up every night at exactly 3:07 a.m. Not 3:06, not 3:08. Always 3:07. I first noticed him a few months ago, but maybe he had been coming long before that. He would walk in from the dark stretch of trees behind the station, stepping out of the black like a shadow peeling itself from the forest. He never arrived in a car. He never walked down the highway. He just came from the woods. And every night, he bought the same thing, 1 gallon of gas. He never spoke unless I asked him something directly. Even then, his voice was low, quiet, like a whisper wrapped in gravel. His eyes were deep set, his skin pale, and he never seemed in a hurry. He would hand me a crumpled bill, wait in silence as I made change, then disappear back the way he came, into the trees. The first few times, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was filling up a generator at a cabin somewhere. Maybe he had a car parked deep in the woods, hidden from sight. But as the nights passed, I started to notice things. His clothes never changed. He always wore the same faded jacket, the same scuffed boots, the same dark jeans stained with something I didn't want to guess. They were worn, but not dirty, like time had passed around them but never through them. The weather never touched him either. One night, it rained so hard that the parking lot flooded, and my shoes squelched with every step. But when Eric walked in, he wasn't wet. His hair, his clothes, his skin bone dry. Another night, the wind was sharp enough to cut, and my breath clouded the air. Eric came through the door, and I swear, no steam rose from his mouth. Like he wasn't breathing at all. That's when the unease started crawling in. One night, I worked up the nerve to ask, "You live around here?" I kept my tone casual, leaning on the counter. Eric looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. His eyes weren't just deep set. They were dark, so dark I couldn't tell where the pupils ended and the irises began. "Around," he said. "Got a cabin or something?" Silence. Then, slowly, he shook his head. The register beeped as I finished ringing up his purchase, and I slid the change across the counter. He didn't take it. He just picked up the gas can and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. I stared after him, heart hammering harder than it should have been. And that was the moment I realized something that froze my blood. The door had chimes. They jingled when anyone walked in or out. But when Eric left, they didn't make a sound. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind howl outside, my breath shallow. Then, forcing myself to move, I grabbed my phone and pulled up the security footage. The screen flickered before loading the grainy, black and white video of the gas station's entrance. I fast-forwarded, watching people come and go, until I reached 3:07 a.m. There was the door swinging open. There was Eric walking in, but my stomach clenched as I watched him leave. Because when he stepped outside, he didn't cast a shadow under the fluorescent lights, and there were no footprints on the wet pavement where he had walked. I sat there, frozen, my hands clammy against the counter. Eric had come to the station every night. But whatever he was, whoever he wasn't just some guy walking in from the woods. And I had a horrible feeling that if I ever tried to follow him, I wouldn't like what I found. Nights at the gas station were usually quiet, boring even, but not tonight. Tonight, something gnawed at me, a feeling deep in my stomach that wouldn't go away. It started the moment Eric left, the sound of his boots fading into the tree line. He had been coming here every night, always the same routine, same clothes, same empty eyes, 1 gallon of gas, paid in cash, no car, just walking back into the woods, disappearing like he was never here. I leaned back in my chair behind the counter, staring at the security monitor. The screen flickered slightly, the grainy black and white footage looping through its usual cycle. The pumps, the empty lot, the front door. I drummed my fingers on the desk, debating if I should check. Then, almost without thinking, I clicked into the recorded footage. I scrolled back to an hour ago, watching myself standing behind the register as Eric walked in. There he was, slow and deliberate, moving straight to the counter. No hesitation, no wasted motion. I skipped ahead a few minutes. He was outside now, holding the gas can as he turned toward the trees. I leaned closer. I could see him clearly in the camera facing the pumps. He walked past the closest light, his long shadow stretching across the pavement. Then, he stepped past the edge of the lot, into the darkness of the forest. I hit rewind, played it again. This time, I watched the ground. The pavement was cracked and dry, a few old tire marks leading to the pumps from customers earlier that night. But Eric, no footprints. I squinted at the screen, scrubbing the footage back and forth. He had walked straight across the lot, but he hadn't left any footprints. No scuff marks, no dirt kicked up, nothing. It was like he had never actually touched the ground. My throat felt tight. That wasn't possible. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe the camera was too low quality to pick up small details. Maybe the pavement was just too firm to hold impressions. But something felt wrong. I scrolled back further, pulling up old recordings from the past week. There he was again. Same routine. 3:07 a.m., on the dot. Buying his gas. Leaving. Still no footprints. I kept going, pulling up footage from last month. Then 3 months ago. I checked the winter footage, the nights when snow covered everything. A trucker had pulled in one night, and I could clearly see his boot prints trailing through the slush. But when Eric walked across that same patch of snow a few nights later, nothing. I leaned back, hands gripping the edge of the desk. My pulse thumped in my ears. That's when I had the thought. How long has he been coming here? I hesitated, my finger hovering over the trackpad. A part of me didn't want to know, but I'd already gone this far. I scrolled back a year, then 5 years. Then I stopped breathing. 15 years ago. The footage was worse, fuzzier, but I could still make him out. Same jacket, same boots, same empty stare. And he hadn't aged a single day. A chill ran down my spine. I should stop watching. I should just stop. But I didn't. Instead, I scrolled back one more time. 20 years ago. There was no gas station yet. The land was still empty, just a dirt road and trees. The footage was mostly static, the camera struggling to make sense of the darkness. But in the corner of the screen, barely visible, I saw him. standing at the edge of the woods, watching. My breath hitched. I slammed the laptop shut. The room suddenly felt too small, too quiet. I could hear the buzz of the overhead light, the hum of the refrigerator in the back. I turned toward the front door, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me through the glass. But the lot was empty. The trees beyond it were still. And yet, I felt something, a weight in the air, pressing against me. Like I wasn't alone, like something had seen me looking. I swallowed hard and checked the clock. 3:06 a.m. My stomach twisted. I knew what was about to happen. I held my breath. And then, right on time, the bell above the door chimed. I knew it was a bad idea the second I stepped out from behind the counter. Eric had just left, the glass door swinging shut behind him. As always, he carried his single gallon of gas, walking toward the tree line at the edge of the station's dim floodlights. He never looked back, never spoke, just walked, like he had somewhere to be. Except I knew for a fact there was nothing out there. No houses, no roads, no cars, just miles of dense forest. Still I followed. The cold hit me first. It wasn't winter yet, but the night air had a bite to it, sharp enough to make my breath fog. My sneakers crunched over gravel as I trailed Eric, keeping my distance, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself I was being stupid. Maybe he had a car parked further down the road, hidden from view. Maybe he lived in some off-the-grid cabin deep in the woods. But my gut told me something different. Eric moved at a steady pace, unbothered by the uneven ground. He didn't make a sound. Not a single twig snap or rustle of leaves. Just that slow, deliberate stride, like he was following a path no one else could see. The gas can in his hand didn't sway. It almost seemed weightless. I swallowed hard and kept going. The glow of the gas station faded behind me, the buzzing lights swallowed by the trees. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. And then, ahead of me, something appeared in the darkness. An old car. It sat in the middle of a clearing, rusted and broken, like it had been abandoned for decades. The windshield was shattered, the tires long since deflated. The doors hung open, revealing a burnt-out interior, the seats charred and torn. But the worst part wasn't the car. It was the gas cans. Dozens of them, scattered around the clearing, some half buried in the dirt, others stacked near the twisted remains of the car. Some were so old their labels had faded completely, metal rusted through with holes. But they all had one thing in common. They were empty. A chill crawled on my spine. Eric had stopped walking. He stood near the car, back to me, still holding his fresh gallon of gas. He hadn't turned around, hadn't acknowledged me. But somehow I knew. He knew I was there. The silence was unbearable. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. Just a deep, suffocating stillness pressing against my ears. Then I heard it. A sound so soft I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Breathing. Not from Eric. Not from me. From beneath the ground. A slow, wet inhale like something was waiting just beneath the surface. I staggered back, my shoe crunching against an old gas can. The sound echoed in the dead air, loud as a gunshot. Eric finally moved. Not to turn around. Not to speak. He bent down and poured the gas onto the dirt. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I followed Eric into the woods. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe some kind of hidden house, a run-down car he kept stashed away, something that would explain why he needed the gas. But after only a few minutes, I realized I had made a mistake. The trees swallowed the light from the gas station almost immediately. The further I went, the dimmer everything became. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, the beam flickering like it was struggling to stay alive. Eric was nowhere to be seen. He had been walking ahead of me, his shadow moving steadily between the trees, but now he was gone. Just like that. I stopped. The air around me was still. No wind. No sound. Even the usual chirping of crickets was absent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping my flashlight over the trees. That's when I saw it. An old car sitting in the middle of a small clearing, rusted and broken. The windows were shattered. The inside was blackened. The seats melted as if they had been burned. Gas cans were scattered around it. Dozens of them. Some looked almost new, but others were old, rusted, their labels worn away by time. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The ground felt soft beneath my feet, almost like something beneath the dirt was shifting. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard it. A sound so deep it felt like it came from inside my own chest. A low, slow breath. I froze. The flashlight shook in my hand. The sound didn't come from the car. It didn't come from behind me. It came from beneath me. I staggered back, nearly tripping over one of the old gas cans. The ground beneath the car let out a noise, a wet, slithering sound. Then something moved. The dirt shifted, and for a split second, I saw something press against the ground from below, as if something huge and alive was buried just beneath the surface. A shape, too long and too thin to be human, twisted against the earth, like it was trying to rise. I ran. I didn't think, didn't breathe, I just ran. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted back toward the station. Branches tore my arms, my legs. The ground felt uneven, like the forest itself was trying to slow me down. And behind me, I heard something else running too. Not footsteps. Something heavier. Something that dragged as it moved. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. By the time I saw the gas station lights flickering through the trees, I was gasping for air. My legs burned. My hand was shaking, so hard I nearly dropped the flashlight. I burst through the gas station door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it. Silence. I pressed my back against the door, listening, waiting, but there was nothing. No footsteps. No rustling in the trees. But I knew something was still out there. And for the first time since I started working here, I was terrified of what might happen if the gas ever ran out. The night air was thick with silence. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest, makes it hard to breathe, like the whole world is holding its breath. I sat behind the counter, staring at the clock. 3:02 a.m. Eric hadn't come in yet. It was the same routine every night. 3:07 a.m. He'd be there, walking out of the woods, buying his gallon of gas, and disappearing back into the darkness. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen in the woods earlier. The car, the cans, that feeling like something was watching me from the trees. My hands felt cold as I gripped the edge of the counter, a shiver crawling up my spine. I tried to push it out of my head. Focus on the clock. Focus on the job. But I couldn't. The longer I sat there, the heavier the air became, like something was building, something I couldn't see yet but could feel in every inch of my skin. Then, like clockwork, the bell above the door chimed. I didn't even look up at first. I was too caught up in my thoughts, the shadows in the back of my mind growing darker by the second. But then I heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps, one after the other, soft but steady, like someone walking through the thickest fog. I glanced up. Eric stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on mine. There was something different about him tonight. The same dark jacket, the same worn boots, the same face I'd seen 1,000 times before. But tonight, there was a sharpness to him. Something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice felt thin, like it might break. He didn't respond, just nodded slightly, and started walking toward the counter. His movements were smooth, too smooth, like he wasn't entirely real. I watched him closely as he slid the crumpled bill across the counter, his gaze never leaving mine. The familiar smell of his old, damp jacket hit me. Earthy, musty, almost like the woods themselves. 1 gallon, he said. His voice was soft, but there was something deeper about it, a weight to it. I nodded and turned to grab the pump, my fingers trembling as I worked. The silence between us stretched out, thick like fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for something. When I turned back around, his gaze was still fixed on me, but now there was something more, a quiet intensity, like he was sizing me up, seeing right through me. It made my skin crawl. I finished filling the gallon and set the pump down. When I reached for the cap to seal it, I saw his hands for the first time. They were pale, almost translucent in the fluorescent light. His fingers looked too long, too thin. I shook my head. It was late, I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then he spoke. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said. The words slipped from his mouth, not with malice, but with something quieter. A warning. I froze. My fingers tightened around the gas cap, my heart starting to race. "What?" I managed to say, my voice sounding too small in the quiet night. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took the gallon from the counter, his fingers brushing against mine. A chill ran through me at the touch. He didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did. Either way, I could feel the shift in the air as he walked past me, heading for the door. "You shouldn't have gone there," he repeated, his voice low, almost like a whisper that echoed in my head long after he'd said it. I watched him leave, stepping out into the night without a single glance back. The door swung shut behind him with a soft creak. The instant the door closed, I felt the temperature drop, as if the world outside had suddenly become colder. A chill wrapped around me, making my teeth chatter. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Gone where? What did he mean? My hands clenched at my sides, nails biting into my palms. I couldn't sit still. I needed to know what he meant. My breath was shallow as I grabbed the keys to my car and bolted for the door. The woods were just beyond the station, and he had made it clear that something was wrong. Something that I wasn't supposed to know, something I shouldn't have seen. I pulled the car into the gravel lot and slammed the door shut. The headlights pierced the darkness, but even they didn't seem to cut through the fog that was beginning to roll in from the trees. The forest was alive with the sound of rustling leaves and distant howls, but there was something different about it tonight. A stillness, an anticipation. I drove past the station, my eyes glued to the tree line as I crossed the road. Something deep in my gut told me to turn back, to forget it all, but I couldn't. Not after what Eric had said. I didn't know how far I'd driven when I stopped the car and stepped out. The air was colder now, the fog so thick I could barely see 5 feet ahead. My heart thudded loudly in my chest as I stared into the darkness of the woods. And then I saw it. A shape standing between 2 trees, just outside the reach of my headlights. It was tall, too tall. A figure that didn't belong there. It was almost human, but it moved with an unnatural grace, its form shifting in the mist. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure watched me for what felt like an eternity before it slowly stepped backward, disappearing into the fog. That's when I realized the thing in the woods wasn't just some shadow. It was real. I ran back to the car, slammed the door, and drove back to the station. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep the steering wheel steady. I hadn't even noticed the fog had followed me, wrapping around the gas station like an invisible blanket. I parked the car, sat there for a long minute, trying to make sense of everything. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run far, far away from this place, but I knew, deep down, I couldn't. It was too late. I wasn't just part of the story now. I was the story. I never liked the way the ground felt beneath my feet at night. Something about it always felt wrong, like the earth was too still, too silent, as if it was holding its breath. Tonight, though, that feeling was unbearable. The air was thick with it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time in months, I wished I was anywhere else but here. I stood behind the counter, staring at the clock. 3:05 a.m. Eric would be here soon, and for the first time, I didn't want him to come. The quiet of the gas station felt oppressive. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, buzzing like a swarm of flies. I tried to ignore it, but that was hard when everything felt wrong. The door opened. I looked up. There he was, standing in the doorway. He was as familiar as a bad dream, and yet he always sent a shiver down my spine. Eric. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, eyes fixed on the ground, waiting. I couldn't help but stare at him, his pale, drawn face, the way his clothes hung too loosely on his thin frame, and the same blank expression that never seemed to change. Same as always. I muttered, almost to myself. He didn't answer, just nodded once. I rang up his gallon of fuel, hands slightly trembling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I set the can on the counter, expecting him to take it and leave like he always did. But this time, he didn't move. Instead, he looked up at me, his gaze locking onto mine. For the first time, he seemed present, almost like he was seeing me for the first time. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said quietly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it felt like it echoed in my head. I froze. I wasn't sure if I'd heard him right. "What?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the silence of the station. "I saw you," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "I saw you follow me. Into the woods." My heart skipped. I didn't want to admit it, but I had followed him. I had thought it would make sense of everything, that it would answer the questions gnawing at me for weeks. I didn't mean to. I started, but he cut me off. "You shouldn't have gone there," he repeated. This time, his voice was harder, almost a warning. "It was never meant for you." I swallowed hard, my pulse picking up. What did he mean by that? What was it that was never meant for me? I felt my throat tighten, and a cold sweat began to creep down the back of my neck. Eric took a slow step toward the counter, his eyes never leaving mine. "The gas," he said, his voice low and almost reverent. "It's not for a car." My stomach twisted. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What are you talking about?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. He sighed, like explaining this was something he'd done too many times. "It's for keeping it buried," he said, his voice distant. "Long ago, something crawled out of the earth, something that should never have been allowed to wake up. It's hungry, and it will take whatever it wants." I stared at him, unsure if I was hearing him right. The idea that something was buried beneath the ground, something that needed the gas to stay asleep, it sounded insane, like something out of a nightmare. I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was crazy, but the look in his eyes, the way he spoke, made me hesitate. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my heart race, like the feeling you get when you know you're being watched, even though you can't see who or what is watching you. I stammered, trying to wrap my head around his words. "You've been feeding it." Eric didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked past me, out the window, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. His face went even paler, his lips thinning. "Every night," he said finally, his voice barely audible, "I've been keeping it asleep. The gas, it's a ritual. It's the only thing that keeps it down. If it wakes up," he didn't finish the sentence. His eyes flicked to the door, and I could see something shift in his gaze, something darker, more desperate. I looked around the station, suddenly feeling trapped. The walls, the fluorescent lights, the shelves stocked with snacks and drinks, they all felt like they were closing in on me. My breath grew shallow, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. But what was worse was the feeling that he wasn't lying, that something was buried beneath the ground, waiting, hungry. Eric took a slow step back from the counter. He was ready to leave, as if the conversation was over, as if everything he'd said was a normal part of his routine. "You have to keep feeding it," he said, his voice flat. "If you don't, it wakes up. It comes for you." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask him more, but the door swung open, and before I could move, Eric was gone, vanishing into the night, into the darkness beyond the gas station. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The clock ticked on, the fluorescent lights buzzed above, and for a long moment, I couldn't move. And then, just as I was starting to convince myself that I had imagined it all, I heard it. A rumble. A deep, shaking sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could feel the vibration running through the floor, up my legs, into my chest. My stomach dropped. It was real. All of it. Something was stirring beneath us, something that had been waiting. And suddenly, I didn't know if I could stay. I didn't know if I would ever be able to leave. I sat in the dim glow of the gas station's flickering lights, staring at the gallon of fuel sitting on the counter in front of me. The cold air around me felt heavier than usual, thick with the weight of the decision I had to make. The clock on the wall ticked away in slow, oppressive seconds. 3:06 a.m. I couldn't look away from it. Every time the second hand clicked past, I could feel the air around me grow colder, like something invisible was pressing in from all sides. It wasn't supposed to be like this. A few days ago, I was just a girl trying to get through the night shift, trying to survive in a small, run-down gas station far away from anything that mattered. Now I was staring down something beyond words. Eric had come again tonight, just like he always did, arriving at 3:07 a.m. But this time, he hadn't left the way he normally did. This time, he had spoken to me, told me things that I didn't want to believe. That thing beneath the ground, the one he had been feeding for years. It was real, and it was hungry. I still didn't want to believe it. But the longer I sat there, alone, the more the weight of his words pressed down on me. It was a nightmare, but it felt too real. I could almost hear the ground beneath the gas station rumbling, a faint vibration beneath my feet. The smell of gasoline was sharper in the air tonight, more nauseating. Was it my nerves? Or was it something else? I glanced over at the clock again. 3:07 a.m. was coming. I didn't want to face it, but I couldn't stop looking at the clock. The seconds ticked down, as if the universe was forcing me to make a choice, whether I was ready or not. There was no denying it now. Something was down there, something that had to be fed. Every part of me screamed to run, to just get in my car and drive away, never looking back. But I knew, deep down, that if I ran, I might never escape. Not really. I'd always remember the rumbling, the shadows, the whispers. That would follow me wherever I went. I reached for the gas can, the cold metal feeling foreign in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady beat that felt too loud in the stillness. The can felt heavier than it should, like it was full of more than just gasoline. It was full of decisions, full of consequences. I thought about Eric's face, his hollow eyes, and the strange way he spoke, like he knew everything, like he had been waiting for this moment. But he was gone now, leaving me with his words, his warning. It won't stop. It won't leave. I took a deep breath and turned the cap on the can. The soft hiss of the gas being released was like a signal, something that I wasn't sure I could undo. I stood there, staring at the small pool of gasoline I'd spilled on the counter. The ritual. It didn't matter that I didn't understand it. It didn't matter that I didn't want to believe it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me. If I didn't do this, it would wake up. I looked at the door, the world beyond it still dark, silent, and waiting. The wind outside howled, a reminder that the night was endless. I could leave. I could walk out into the darkness, get in my car, and drive. I could pretend none of this ever happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. I couldn't outrun this. Whatever it was. I walked to the back door, the sound of my footsteps unnervingly loud in the stillness. The door creaked open, and the cold air hit me immediately. I stepped outside, my breath fogging in front of me. The night was so quiet, so thick with the unknown, that it felt like the forest around the station was holding its breath. I didn't look back as I walked toward the edge of the woods, the gallon of fuel in my hand, now feeling like a lifeline and a noose at the same time. I reached the edge of the clearing, the trees standing like silent sentinels, waiting. The ground felt soft beneath my boots, the earth unnaturally warm, as if something was stirring beneath. I hesitated for just a moment. Was I really doing this? But I didn't need to hesitate. I could feel it, the weight of the decision sinking into my bones. Eric's voice echoed in my head. Someone else will do it if you don't. The silence pressed against me, suffocating, and the breathing beneath the earth seemed to grow louder, heavier, like a warning. I poured the gasoline into the dirt, watching it seep into the ground, the smell of it sharp and nauseating. The weight of what I was doing sank deeper, the knowledge that this was the point of no return. I took one last look at the gas station, the lights still flickering in the distance. Then I turned away, walking back toward the door, my feet feeling heavier with each step. The clock on the wall still read 3:07 a.m. And I knew deep down it wasn't over. I stared at the gallon of fuel sitting on the counter, its plastic surface gleaming under the dim fluorescent lights. The clock read 3:06 a.m. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, and with it, something far worse than any nightmare could ever be. My hand shook, but I didn't move. I couldn't. The air around me was suffocating, thick with the tension I could feel in my bones. My eyes flicked to the window, out into the inky blackness of the woods, where the wind stirred the branches and made them groan like they were alive. But it wasn't the wind that had my stomach tied in knots. It was the memory of what I'd found in that clearing. The gas cans, old and rusted, scattered like forgotten offerings. And the thing, whatever it was, breathing beneath the ground, waiting. Eric had told me the truth. He had to. I knew it deep in my gut. Whatever had been buried out, there was hungry. And if I didn't give it what it wanted, it would wake up. I was its new keeper, whether I liked it or not. The station was dead silent, except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights above me. The air was still, but I could feel something crawling through the room, invisible yet unmistakable. 3:07 a.m. My heart hammered in my chest as if it knew something I didn't. I glanced at the door. The night was thick outside, no moonlight breaking through the clouds, only darkness stretching endlessly. But I knew, Eric would be back. He would come at his usual time. I didn't need to see him and know he was out there, waiting. I could feel his presence, like a shadow, just beyond the glass, like he was always there. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I shifted, my legs stiff and sore. I had never felt more alive and more terrified in my entire life. This job, this cursed, lonely job, had always been just that, a job. A way to make ends meet, to escape a life I didn't want. But now it was something else. It was a trap. I moved slowly toward the door, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle. The night stretched out before me, an abyss of questions I knew I wasn't ready to answer. But then it happened. The ground trembled. At first, it was a soft rumble, almost like a distant train. But it didn't stop. It built, slowly, steadily, until the entire building seemed to groan with it. The floor beneath me buckled, just for a second. The walls shivered. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I knew what it was. I knew. The thing beneath the gas station had woken up. A sound like the cracking of bone echoed through the walls, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. I glanced at the door again, but it was no longer just a door. It was a barrier, something fragile and thin that couldn't protect me from what was coming. The lights flickered, once, twice, and then they went out. The station was plunged into darkness. The hum of the lights was gone, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. And then the smell hit me. It wasn't like anything I had ever smelled before. It was rot. It was earth. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. The air was thick with it, heavy, suffocating, like the ground itself was alive and trying to crawl up into the station. I rushed to the window, my hands smudging the glass as I pressed my face to it. The world outside was still, motionless. But the ground, oh God, the ground was shifting. I saw it in the distance, just a faint, writhing movement beneath the earth. The earth wasn't still anymore. It was alive, breathing, moving. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare in disbelief as the soil around the gas station began to crack open. The earth groaned and split apart, like it had been waiting for this moment for years, centuries. The sound was so loud, so crushing, I thought my ears would bleed from it. Then it came. A shape, massive, dark, and shadowy, emerged from the crack in the earth. It was no longer something buried, something hidden beneath the surface. It was here. Its form was like nothing I had ever seen. It was a blur of shadows and shapes, like the very essence of nightmares given life. The ground seemed to pulse with it, ripples of dark energy spreading out from the crack where it had emerged. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, my head spinning. My chest was tight, and I could barely breathe. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to be real. But it was. The creature was closer now, its form massive and terrifying. I could hear it, feel it, moving towards the station. It didn't have a face, or if it did, it was something too horrible to comprehend. It was hunger incarnate, waiting to feed. I scrambled to my feet, my mind a blur of fear and desperation. But then I remembered something that made my stomach churn even more. Eric had warned me. He had said I couldn't stop it, and it was too late. The earth trembled again, and I heard the thing whisper to me, not with words, but with a sound that was like 1,000 voices speaking all at once. It was calling me. It wanted me. The lights flickered back on, but it didn't matter. The station was already falling apart around me. The walls were cracking, the floor buckling, and I realized with horror that I was trapped. The thing was coming for me, and there was no way out. As the darkness swallowed the light and the earth split wide open, I knew this was it. The horror was free, and there was no one left to stop it.